Welcome to the Bo and Luke Show, a podcast designed to inspire you to be better, know better, and do better. You can connect with Bo and Luke on social media at The Bo and Luke Show, or send us an email at fanfeedback@theboandlukeshow.com. Brought to you by Sound United. Without further ado, let's get after it. Bo and Luke Nation, here we are. We have a great guest in studio with us today. I'm your co-host, Bo Brabo, and this is my co-host.
This is Luke Carrignan, and today we have an extra special treat. We're going to be talking about feedback today, and this is going to be something where not only will you be able to help the other people around you, you're going to get better and be able to help yourself by being open to that feedback, going and seeking it out. So we're like, okay, well, where do we start if we want to talk about feedback? So we decided to bring me on that wrote the book on feedback, which is probably a good place to start. So today, and this intro is going to be awesome because she's so decorated, we have Brodie Riordan, Dr. Brodie Riordan, I apologize, who's an industrial psychologist, executive coach, author, and professor. She is the author of Feedback Fundamentals and Evidence-Based Best Practices and Using Feedback in Organizational Consulting. She's done more than 24 articles and book chapters and topics on high performance, leadership, and motivation. She is part-time faculty in the MBA program at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland and in the HR Master's program at Georgetown University. Brodie also manages her own practice, partnering with organizations and leaders to unlock their full potential. And previously, Brodie co-led global partner learning and development at McKinsey & Company, and also held global leadership roles and corporate executive board and Procter & Gamble. In addition, after doing that intro, she's made me realize how much I've really squandered my life. So that's going to be feedback for myself. Brodie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Luke. And I don't think you've squandered your life. I think
thank you.
You're probably reaching a lot more people through your podcast than I have through any of the things that I've done.
Oh, I doubt that. But maybe after this episode, who knows?
Hey, people love talking about feedback, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Not really, but let's hope that they feel that way after today.
That's right. So it's great. It's amazing to have you on here. I've known you for years now, and I don't think we've ever sat down and really had a serious conversation about this. And I think that, selfishly, Bo and I are going to get a ton out of it, but our listeners will too.
Sure.
Clearly, you don't get to do all of this stuff without being extremely passionate about it. Where does that passion come from? Can you just walk us through that a little bit to start off?
Absolutely. It's pretty unusual to be such a feedback enthusiast. I think it surprises people a lot because it's such a specific topic. But at the end of the day, I just love my occupation so much. I love being an industrial psychologist. This is what I was meant to do. And I'm so fortunate that I discovered this occupation. And it all happened by serendipity. I was a junior in college and I was, I'd already signed up to be a psychology major, but I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. And then the person who would eventually become my PhD advisor was an alum of the university that I attended and came back to give a job talk about industrial psychology. And it was like the light bulb went off for me. It was like, this is the thing that I've been looking for. And at the heart of it, one thing I realized a few years ago, that what really motivates me is helping people achieve their full potential. And the reason IO psychology, industrial organizational psychology, is a great fit for me is because people spend so much time at work, and it creates an incredible platform to help people learn and grow and develop and become better people and also make better contributions to their organizations. And everyone benefits when people are doing work that is using their skills and that they're excited about. It's good for them. It's good for the organization. And so most of my career has focused on how can we help people be the best that they can be through the avenue of work.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And I want to jump in. I want this to be as useful as possible for everybody. I want to jump into your book right away because I believe that feedback is something that people are bad at on multiple levels, and it's like rampant. And when you see somebody that's really with feedback, and there's two ways, either giving it or taking it, right? It's really impressive to see. And those are the people that really grow the quickest and get beyond everybody else. Tell us about the inspiration behind this book, your goals for writing it, and then.
So the inspiration for this book started with, I did research and work on the topic of feedback way back when I was doing my PhD. I wrote my first book for the American Psychological Association on feedback and consulting, 6 or 7 years ago. And one thing that always struck me was we actually know so much from science and research about what makes feedback effective, little nuances that can kind of make it or break it. We have a different way of talking about feedback in the academic literature than what I would see in most of the organizations that I worked with. And so I always thought, isn't it a shame that we know so much about what makes feedback work and how it can really help people grow and develop and have higher performance? But the reality is that doesn't reach most people. There are some good resources and some good books out there on feedback. What I was really trying to achieve with this book was take the best of what we know from science and research and present it to people in a way that felt approachable and like they could actually take it and go use it in their life right after they read the book, right? So trying to make it super tactical, super actionable, feel a little bit more approachable, and ultimately make feedback feel a little bit less intimidating and less like a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's huge. That is absolutely huge. What is it do you think it is where I feel like we all know people who get their guard put up with the people that are bad at taking feedback, and then there's other people. There's many parts to this question, I guess, but the people that are bad at taking the feedback, and then why are people so bad at giving it sometimes? And it's like I see it at work where you'll ask people for feedback, and they just want to be nice, and they won't tell you what's actually happening, and then you just never improve. You kind of get stagnant, or even worse, you think you're doing a great job and you're not.
I think at the heart of both of those things is emotions, right?
Sure.
So, when we look at people's experiences receiving feedback over the course of their lives, because this starts when you're a kid, with your parents, with your teachers, with your coaches, with all the people in your orbit, your Boy Scout troop leader, whomever. Most people don't know how to give feedback in a way that is effective and constructive and conducive to taking positive action, right? And so people learn to become defensive in reaction to a lot of feedback that they receive. And feedback, if it ever feels critical or evaluative or judgmental, creates a really strong emotional reaction in the person who's receiving it. And one thing that I think is really helpful for people to understand is that you're hardwired to have a reaction like that. It's part of your threat response. So if someone gives you feedback and you feel like it's criticizing you or your behavior or your capabilities, you are absolutely going to have an immediate, strong, fast emotional reaction to that. And the problem with that is it's impossible to think rationally and really hear and understand and digest that feedback when you're emotionally charged. So one of the first things I always tell people is that when you're receiving feedback, first and foremost, recognize how your brain works. Know that you're hardwired to have this immediate emotional reaction. Let that pass. This is why we say things like when you're angry, count to 10, because you have to let that emotional reaction pass to give cognition time to catch up so that you can think rationally and reasonably about something. So wait until you can actually think coolly about the feedback that you're receiving. And sometimes you might need more time, right? If you're having a conversation with your partner or a colleague and you're having a really charged feedback conversation, you might need to say something like, I just need some time to process this. Can we come back to it in an hour or later today or tomorrow morning? So the first thing that is important to know about feedback is that emotions play a really big part in it. And what causes that emotional reaction is poorly delivered feedback, right? Mm-hmm. We give feedback that is vague. It's focused on the person, their character, their abilities. It's not timely. We give it in a way that's not actionable. And all of those things are what elicit those emotional reactions and really hijack people. And over the course of our lives, we actually develop what we call a feedback orientation. So depending on the experiences that you've had over the course of your life, you develop this general attitude, how you feel about feedback. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you actively seek it out? Do you avoid it? Do you value it? Do you think that it's useful to help you grow and develop and have higher performance? And our feedback orientation is shaped through a culmination of all of the experiences that we have in life and work. The good thing is it can also change, right? We can learn to love feedback, and by having more positive feedback interactions, you can start to sort of move the ship toward having a more positive feedback orientation.
That's incredibly interesting. There's so many things going on in my mind right now about feedback and just the way that we see it. It is good to know that we're supposed to have that reaction, but I also think there's different reactions in different parts of your life that you can work on. So, for example, I've seen people that are great at accepting feedback at work. They don't get that defensive. They don't, they actually learn from it and they move on. Same person, horrible at it in a relationship or with their spouse. And that's like that guard goes up on that personal side of things, but with somebody that they're not that close to, that guard is down for some reason or whatever.
Absolutely. The context matters, and even more, the relationship matters, right? Feedback doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not a transaction. It happens in the context of the pre-existing relationship that we have, and how much we trust the person who's giving us feedback, what we think their intentions are, how comfortable we are being really candid and letting our guard down versus feeling like we have to act really professional, even if we're like dying on the inside.
Sure.
So the relationship is a really important part of this. And every time that you are exchanging feedback with someone else, it's an opportunity to either invest in or diminish that relationship. There's been some research in the positive psychology world on something called the positivity ratio. And some of this science is kind of controversial. Like people have tried to refute it, but it's actually it's held up pretty well and it's been replicated. But the positivity ratio basically says that for every one negative interaction that you have with someone that you care about, you basically need to have 3 positive interactions to offset it and create a buffer. So when you think about feedback, this doesn't mean, in a given conversation, for every negative thing you say, you have to say 3 positive things. It's a longer timeline than that. But basically, in a relationship, either with a colleague or your partner or a family member or a friend, when you look at the duration of your relationship, you want to make sure that your positive interactions, the things that you're saying or doing for that person, outweigh the negative by a factor of 3. One of the problems with positive feedback is that people typically aren't very specific. Another thing about our brains is that we're hardwired to think in a greater level of detail and specificity about negative things. And we tend to think in more generalities about positive things. So, Bo, if I was like, Bo, you're in such a good mood. Why are you in such a good mood? You wouldn't think really hard about like, man, why am I in such a good mood? What's causing that? But if you were really grumpy, you would probably be doing some searching and some reflection to understand the cause. And the same is true of feedback. We tend to be much more specific when we're giving negative feedback and much more vague with positive feedback, which is a missed opportunity. If you're at work and someone really crushed it on a project, you just say like, oh, Luke, that was awesome. Great job. That's really not good feedback. It doesn't tell you what you did well or why it matters. It's a total missed opportunity to invest in that relationship and help you understand what you did really well and why it mattered.
Yeah,
wow.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, my mind is getting blown right now.
Yeah, there's so many avenues to take this. So what about, when someone who's not good at receiving feedback, and you mentioned that it's most of the time due to they've received awful feedback or the person they were getting it from wasn't good at giving it. How much of that even lends to the individuals who are giving the feedback, they're in that position to do so, comes down to just an overall lack of leadership, that they don't have any leadership skills as a whole. Mm-hmm. And maybe the people they're giving the feedback to don't respect them or see them as good leaders in the first place.
Well, I'm really glad you asked about that, because 2 of the most important factors in the feedback provider are trust and credibility. Mm-hmm. So in order for people to accept your feedback, not get defensive, to see value in it, you have to see the feedback provider as someone who you trust and who has credibility. And that credibility could mean they know what they're talking about, right? So I'm sure we've all had experiences where someone gives you feedback on something and you're like, oh, you don't have any idea what you're talking about. And you just completely disregard the feedback. So I do think that your relationship with the other person, your perception of that person, if you trust their intentions, if you think they actually know what they're talking about, if you respect them, those are huge factors in whether or not you will actually accept the feedback that they provide and how you'll react to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I think that's amazing. Which takes me even to another line of thought, wherein in this country alone, the professional development world is it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that companies are spending literally billions of dollars on professional development programs for their people. But it's one of the most underperforming industries that we have from results of people being trained or supposedly developed, which makes it even more fascinating, the work that you're doing, and be like, yeah, that's why there's so many different avenues into this as to why people may or may not accept feedback or give feedback well. I think it's just all interesting.
Hard. Absolutely. Behavior change is really hard. And when you think about professional learning or training or coaching, you can learn the right things to do and know the right things to do. But if you can't convert that into actual behavior change, it doesn't matter.
Right.
And this is where things like feedback and goals play a really, really critical part. One of my favorite frameworks related to feedback is, it's in my book. It's really simple. And it basically shows, like, on your left hand is your current state. On your right hand is your desired state, any goal that you have. And this could be personal, professional, high stakes, mundane, but feedback is what tells you the distance between where you are and where you need or want to be, right? So when we're thinking about behavior change, and improving our performance and achieving our goals, if we don't have high quality feedback, we're basically lost and we don't know where we stand with respect to achieving those goals. And the more specific feedback is, if it's forward looking, if it's what we call negative feedback, which is basically highlighting a deficit, it tells you exactly what you need to do to get closer to your goals. The question is just, can you get high quality feedback, and are you willing to accept it? And then do you know what to do with it?
Yeah. Yeah, that is perfect.
That's the hard part.
It's the hard part for a lot of people, right?
That's what my mind is still blown on doing 3 positive things for every 1 negative thing. And I'm just thinking about things in my life where I don't practice that and how much things could be improved by implementing. That's something I can implement right now. And I think start to see results.
Absolutely. And the great thing about it, think of it as like an emotional bank account, right? Every time you have a positive interaction, you're making a deposit in that emotional or relational bank account. And so then when something difficult happens and you have to make a withdrawal, you have a really healthy balance. And, I've noticed in my career that people tend to be a little bit stingy with positive feedback.
Sure.
Which is really unfortunate. I've talked to some leaders who have these really cynical views that if I give people too much positive feedback, it's going to make them soft, and, I need to be hard and only give people tough feedback. Well, people also need to know what they're doing well, right? So they can do more of that in the future and learn from that.
Yeah, for sure. I think about too, we could equate it to Luke and I doing this show, and we're always asking for feedback. We ask for feedback when we're talking, like now, say, hey, send us feedback. We ask for it in our social media posts and so forth. And when it does trickle in, or when it does come in, it whether good or bad, it's like you just stand up and clap your hands because you got some feedback, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And then when you're working a lot, even for solopreneurs or entrepreneurs and startups, and you don't have a lot of people that you're working with day in, day out, maybe doing a lot of things on your own, I would think that's the one thing that even for myself that I miss the most is feedback, because you got to have that mechanism for measuring, like you said, how far it is to get to the right hand, and how far is that gap really? Because if you don't know, it can become a mental challenge every day.
You're sort of in a vacuum. Yeah. And to just rely on your own perceptions and judgments is hard, right? Most of the feedback that we get on a day-to-day basis is actually self-generated, right? We are constantly gauging ourselves, with respect to the world around us and other people and what we're working on. But you can't just rely on your own self-generated feedback, and getting feedback from other people helps you gain self-awareness to know what you're doing well, where you have opportunities, It helps you assess your progress toward goals. One suggestion that I have, even as you ask for feedback on the podcast, in general, the more specific you are in your ask, the higher quality feedback you're going to get from other people. Mm-hmm. So if you just say like, oh, give me some feedback, it's too open-ended and people won't know what to say. The best thing to do is to be very directed in what you want feedback on, right? So I might say, Luke, I really enjoyed joining you and Bo on this podcast today. One of my development goals is I'm trying to be more concise. If we were to do this podcast all over again next week, what's one thing that you think I could do differently to be more concise or to be more effective? And so I'm telling you exactly what it is that I want feedback on, what I'm working on, why it matters to me. And then a really special trick that you can use to make people more open to feedback is to put that forward-looking lens on it. So I said, if we were to do this podcast again next week, what's one thing you think I could do differently? One of the challenges with feedback is that it is by definition backward looking, but we give it to try to influence people's future behavior. And people often get defensive because feedback is backward looking. There's nothing you can do about it, right? Unless you have a time machine. But if we put that forward-looking lens on it and say, next time this happens, why don't you try X, Y, Z? It sort of gives people a chance at redemption, a do-over, and makes them a lot more open to the feedback because, there's actually something they can go and do with it.
Mm-hmm. I love how you got really specific with it and then said, I'm focusing on this. So it puts somebody in the mindset that the feedback they're going to, even if they think their feedback is negative, that it's going to have a positive result on you, which they're obviously going to want to give you a positive result. So it takes what would be construed as negative and puts a positive lens on it. And I think that's awesome. I've not even thought about trying that.
And the value of asking for feedback in that way is you're basically opening the door for the other person to give you feedback. Earlier you said, why do people not give feedback? It's typically because they're really afraid of how you're going to react.
Yeah.
People are often even more uncomfortable giving feedback than they are receiving it. In fact, there was one study that some people at NYU and the Neuro Leadership Institute did that actually measured people's heart rate going into a feedback exchange. And they found that people who were giving feedback had, I can't remember the specifics, it was either just as high or even higher heart rate than the people who were about to receive it. They were so anxious about having to deliver this message and worried about how the other person was going to react.
Yeah. Does that fall in line with even companies that do, because I experienced this numerous times, employee engagement surveys or some type of surveys across the company. And a lot of responses that you get for people not wanting to participate is because they number one, they don't feel it's anonymous and they don't know what the response to their feedback is going to be, or they have fear of that response. And obviously potentially in a negative fashion, right? Like the company either won't do anything about what I say, they don't care about what I say, or they'll take what I say wrong and something bad will happen or something worse will happen. The environment will just get worse than it is today, type of thing.
Absolutely. Those are two of the biggest challenges with things like employee engagement surveys. One is, and this really stems back to the organization's culture and the level of trust and how those results have been used in the past. But people often fear that it's not anonymous and they might be retaliated against if they say something critical. And then also, if you're in an organization and you've contributed to this survey 5 years in a row and nothing ever happens, and you feel like, why should I take the time to fill this out? No one's going to do anything with it. And that's why it's really important that if you're going to get feedback from people, especially at an organizational level like that, you need to do something with it, or eventually people are just going to stop giving it to you.
Yeah,
that's right. That's correct.
You can say the same thing about individuals, right? If you are constantly giving someone feedback and they don't seem to care, or they pretend like they care, but then they never do anything with it, why would you be motivated to give them feedback in the future?
Yeah, you wouldn't. That's just plain and simple.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is.
I feel like this has helped me already.
Yeah, no, it has. We need to get specific, Luke, and what we're asking.
So what are you going to do with it? That's the real question.
So I can tell you right now, two things that I'm going to do. So number one, emotional bank account, like you said. So I'm going to start doing 3 positives for every 1 negative and just be really, so I'm gonna do 3 things. I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna start being more mindful and conscious of the feedback that I'm giving and receiving, right? And then I am going to, and I think this is going to be the kicker, change the way that I ask for feedback to be super specific and put that positive twist on it to say, hey, I would like your feedback for this because I'm focusing on getting better at this. What can I do to be better next time? And I'm thinking of ways I can actually do it today, like after this call, and I can do it. And I know it'll work because it makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Even like if you're doing like business meetings, right? So like if you're in sales, for example, I'm in sales, so I'm just going to throw this out there. If other people are, why not ask your client that you're talking to, and at the end of like a presentation or a meeting that you have, why not go to them and say, hey, one of the things that I'm focusing on is really truly understanding the problems that you're solving. Can I have feedback on what I could have done, what I could do better next time to better understand your problems and to, improve this partnership? And I think that'd just be an amazing way to strengthen those relationships and move yourself and the business forward that you're in.
Absolutely. Can you imagine the impact that could have on your relationship?
It'd be insane. I don't know why I haven't been doing that on every call.
Just make sure that when you have that conversation, you're really listening. Mm-hmm. So this is another thing I see a lot in my work. Most people go through the motions of listening, right? I'm sure you guys don't, because you're very skilled and you have this podcast, so you listen very deeply. But if you go through the motions of listening and then you are basically just thinking about how you're going to respond, you shouldn't even bother to have the conversation in the first place, right? It's a lost opportunity. People can tell when you are or are not really listening, and it can really undermine other attempts that you're making at strengthening the relationship. So make sure you're really listening to understand, listening with the other person in mind, not listening with yourself in mind. Because you're going to take more away from the conversation, and it's going to create a higher quality moment between you and Luke, in your instance, with that client.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, and then I want you to tell listeners how they can find your book, because everyone's going to want to dig into this and get better. But my wife, when I told her when I was interviewing you, because you've known her for a little while, she had, first of all, great things to say about you. But one of the things that she pointed out was she said Brodie is one of the best listeners that I've ever met in my life. And I think that's largely attributes to why she's so successful. I've learned, and maybe this is just for me, but I have to think it's other people too. Listening sounds so easy, but it's like the hardest thing to do on earth. And I don't think anyone's natural at it. What do you do? How did you hone that in and get really good at it? Or is it something you constantly work at?
Listening is really hard, and it takes a lot of effort. And I think because we can hear, most of us who are fortunate enough to have our hearing can hear all the time. We think that it's less effortful than it really is, right?
Sure.
I do think I'm a pretty good listener, and I've gotten to that point. It's been a real journey, right? A lot of it actually started with my dad. When I was a kid, he would call me out on it. Like if I was just thinking about how I was going to respond and then I'd fire something back, he would say, you aren't really listening. You're just thinking about how you're going to respond. So wow. My dad is an example of an amazing feedback provider. He tells you the things that sometimes are hard to hear, but that will really leave an impact. So that's probably where it started for me. And then I think I've made some really terrible missteps in my life by not listening. And those moments have stuck with me. That I never want to have an experience like that again, where I'm half-heartedly listening to someone and I misunderstand them and then I say something stupid in response. Mm-hmm. And then what really strengthened it for me was mostly my training as a coach, because listening is such a huge part of coaching. And we did a lot of exercises to focus on listening. And one of the things I love the most from that training is this idea of levels of listening. So in coaching, you talk about 3 levels, but I think for most people, the first 2 levels are what's most important. Level 1 listening is when you are listening with yourself in mind. So Bo, let's say you just went on vacation and I'm like, oh, Bo, you just went on vacation. How was your vacation? And you say back to me, it was great. I went and got an Airbnb in the mountains. And I say, Oh, I love the mountains. I just went to the mountains this summer too. So that's level one listening. I responded to you about myself. And I'm sure you've both had lots of conversations like this. You've probably met people who every conversation and everything they say always turns it back to them. This is fine in like chit chat, right? In daily conversation. And that's also a way to create connection and empathy to find things that you have in common. Level two listening is when you are really listening to the other person and with them in mind. So if we took the vacation example again, you said, oh, I got an Airbnb out in the mountains. I would say, what was it like to get out of town for a while? I would follow your lead and go deeper on what you just told me, right? Instead of flipping the conversation back to myself. And listening at that level where you really stay focused on the other person and following the thread and following their interests creates a much more high quality dialogue with other people.
Wow. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, that's amazing. I need to get out of level one and get into the level two.
Level one isn't always a bad thing, right? That's basically how that's how you have a conversation, right? But if you want to really listen at a level of depth, make sure that you're listening for the other person, not for yourself.
It's so hard though. I mean, I feel like, and maybe it's gotten harder as time has progressed with all these distractions. I mean, we're in a multitasking world right now where you have phones and watches that are beeping at you and screens in front of people all the time. I just find that it's not getting any easier at all to be a good listener. And for the people that are, now that I'm like, I've trained myself a little bit just to recognize the people that are really good at listening. And it's like they're superhuman. It's like a superpower for them, you know, especially in the professional world.
Well, you guys talk to a lot of athletes, right? This isn't unlike any other kind of conditioning that you would do, right? It's a muscle that you strengthen, and the sort of self-discipline that you need to be mindful and be focused, you strengthen that every time you use it. Also, for me, I have to set myself up for success. Like my phone is almost always on do not disturb. I have no notifications on my email, because anytime I get a distraction like that, it completely undermines my ability to listen. So, you know, you have to work with your environment. And if you're in a place where you know you don't want to be distracted and you want to listen very closely, set yourself up for success by, you know, turning off your phone or eliminating whatever distractions.
You get so much more done. So much more effective. Bo, my mind is blown. I know we're doing this to like teach something new to all the listeners, but I'm learning just as much, maybe more.
Yeah, it is. It's a really fascinating topic. And as Brodie, as you've been talking, I sit here thinking about just multiple examples of maybe not using the same words that you're using, but just things that I've done. And it struck me as funny. And Luke, talking about your wife, you know, my wife will say something to me and I won't have an immediate response. And she's like, were you listening to me? And I'm like, well, yeah, I was listening to you. And that's why I don't have a response right away, because I have to think about what it is that you just said to me. Right. I wasn't spending the whole time preparing my response. I say I was listening to what you were saying, and I don't have a response yet because I need to process what you just said.
Just tell her you're in level two.
I'm in level two. Now I will. Now I have other tools in my tool belt to respond and say, hey, I'm in level two listening. I'm really elevated here in my ability and our relationship. Right.
That's right. I want to make sure that I'm giving 3 positive reactions and that it's meaningful and that I'm adding something to the conversation, not just bringing it back to myself.
Yeah. One thing I always found that really helped do the types of things Brodie's talking about, like in order to actually listen. And I think for me personally, I was fortunate in growing up, learning how to, not as a kid, but when I joined the military, always being on the receiving end. You know, as you're coming up the ranks, you're not the one talking. You're always listening to somebody else give orders, whatever the case might be. And if you didn't listen, well, that could be a rough day for you. So I learned real quick how to listen. And now, like, because when we get busy, I found one tactic, Luke, that works for me. If someone comes into my office and as an HR executive, you would always be busy. But if someone needed to talk to me, I would stand up so that I wasn't looking at my computer. I wasn't looking at the phone or anything that might pop up on the computer screen. I was above it. And then I would have a conversation with them eye to eye. And not be distracted, right? Because it's just too easy. It's too easy to get distracted. and not pay attention and not listen to what.
Well, that's a great practice. And you're showing the other person through your physical actions that you're really present and you're in the conversation. I also love what you said about your wife and not having an immediate reaction. You know, it's funny because we get conditioned to communicating being like a ping pong match, right? And it's like we feel like we have to respond immediately. But the reality is, if you're really listening, you need a moment to formulate your thoughts and what you're going to say next. And so for me, I've gotten in the habit of, you know, if I'm on a call or even a Zoom, I will just say, I'm thinking, you know, so the other person, because silence makes people so uncomfortable, but sometimes you just need time to process. And so saying like, you know, I'm in level 2 listening, I don't have a response yet. At least the other person knows what's, you know, that you're really paying attention and you're processing what they're saying.
Right.
Yep. It's true. Yeah. The listening portion is amazing. One person I've noticed that is super good at this, and I think a lot of people are, but and look, he's on Fox News. I don't care who you like, what affiliations you have or whatever. Anyways, Tucker Carlson is a master listener. And I think if I watch him, like all of the success that he has can be attributed to it. And you can almost see like when somebody's talking, he has a different look on his face when he's actively listening that way, because there's no way with all the stuff popping in, like in his earpieces or what's going on, it is humanly impossible to learn everything he needs to know for those conversations the way that they're coming at him. And you could not be that successful without doing that. And to be able to do that day in and day out is just insane. And I think without that, you know, I'm sure a lot of anchors are like that, but it's just, it's amazing to me to be able to see it in action.
Well, and you can tell when someone who is an anchor or has a talk show is a really skilled listener, because the conversations are a lot more interesting. I was just watching, there's a show on Netflix called, I think it's called My Next Guest. It's the David Letterman show.
Oh, sure.
And he is such a masterful interviewer, and he listens at an incredible level of depth and will latch on to a little thing that someone says and pull that thread and ask them about it. And as a result, the conversation goes in all kinds of random directions, and it makes it really, really interesting.
Yeah, that's why I love, like when I'm speaking to groups and so forth, I love fireside chats, because I love to get engaged with the people in the audience versus just say you're the only one delivering a keynote address and people aren't talking back to you. Because I love to be able to pull on threads of what somebody might say. And you're right, that comes with being able to focus in on what they're saying and listening.
Well, and to really come full circle, Bo, I totally hear you. And I think that's also a form of feedback, right? Because if you're just standing up at the front of the room talking at people, you get no feedback back from them, unless they're all looking at their phones and falling asleep.
Right.
You know, that's pretty clear feedback.
Right.
But when they're asking you questions and they're actively engaged in the conversation, that's essentially a form of feedback that tells you where their interests are and helps you direct where you're going in a way that's appealing to your audience.
Right. Yep. Outstanding.
This is amazing. Well, Brodie, before we wrap up, tell our audience more about where they can find your book, how to get in contact with you, tell companies how to hire you. Let's hear it, because I'm sure everyone's going to want to get in touch.
I hope that people will read the book. You know, I've tried to make feedback feel a little more approachable, interesting, valuable. I want people to hate feedback 10% less after they read the book. And, you know, go forward and actually try out some of the things that are in it. The book is available on Amazon. It's called Feedback Fundamentals and Evidence-Based Best Practices. It's also, if you want to support smaller businesses, a handful of bookstores have it, like Politics and Prose in DC. You can order it on their website. And I think, you know, any other place online where you would buy books, you can probably find it. But Amazon, if you're dying to read it tomorrow, you know, and get it to your door. And then if people ever want to connect and learn more, the best way to reach me is my email, which is Brodie, Brodie, at my company website, which is called Ocular, and it's at seewithocular.com. So it's Brodie, Brodie, at seewithocular.com.
This is amazing. Thank you so much, Brodie.
My pleasure. Can I leave you with a few quick tidbits to make your feedback more effective? Okay, so for your listeners, if you only remember 4 things from this conversation about how to give more effective feedback. The first one is make your feedback as specific as possible. The more specific your feedback is, the easier it is for people to do something with it. So when you're about to give feedback, ask yourself, can I be more specific? Can I be more specific? Push yourself to be really specific. The second thing is be evidence-based. Give feedback that focuses on things that you can see with your own eyes. People often get themselves into trouble when they are doing things like making assumptions or inferences about why someone does something. You can't see inside their brain. So even if you really think you know, you probably don't. So focus on things you can see with your own eyes. Make sure your feedback is always focused on behavior, not the person, whether it's positive or negative. You always want to focus on what people are doing or what they did, not who they are. So never give feedback on personality, abilities, character, intelligence, even if it's positive, right? You don't want to be like, oh, you're brilliant or you're a superstar. No, focus on what they did or what they do. And then the last thing is give feedback as soon as possible, right? Especially in organizations, and I think this is changing a little bit, but in a lot of organizations, people sort of store up their feedback until they have a formal conversation, which might be once a year or twice a year or once a quarter. That's pretty much useless. And it really makes people feel terrible and actually results in a drop in performance after the performance review. So I would just encourage people to get in the habit of giving feedback as soon as possible after something happens. It shows that you care. It enables the person to actually take action and do something with it. And it will also prevent them from getting defensive. Just make sure you give it in private. People also don't like getting feedback in front of other people.
That's good advice.
There you have it.
Brodie, that was amazing. Bo, any closing thoughts here?
Oh, I have so many because it's a fascinating topic, and I'm a proponent of all of it: giving feedback, asking for feedback, taking it, receiving feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. I'm the kind of person I want it all, and I do my best to share it in a way that's constructive for individuals to either continue to do things they do well, continue to do them well. And if they need areas that they have to work on, then to share that too. So yeah, just really thank you, Brodie, for spending some time with us, and for our listeners, I'm sure they'll appreciate it. And hey, guys, go out there, buy the book, read it. We're huge proponents of professional books. Use what you can use from them, and read. It's a great form of education.
Yep. Brodie Riordan, everybody. If you're a listener, get the book, get better. If you run a company, hire Brodie, you'll make more money. Couldn't be more grateful for having you on. And that's a wrap.
Tune in for a new episode every Thursday. You can subscribe to our email newsletter for information on upcoming guests, giveaways, and more. Rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you to our sponsor, Sound United, for quality broadcast audio throughout Season 2.